I'm Amber Watts. I'm an associate professor of clinical psychology, and my research focuses on biological and behavioral-based risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And today I'm going to talk about estrogen and Alzheimer's disease. So this is particularly relevant to women's risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So I'm going to start with a refresher about what hormones do in the body and why they are so important. Typically, we think about hormones as chemicals that influence reproductive health and differentiate between men and women. However, they do many important things for us. So they are powerful chemicals involved in important processes in the brain and the body, including things like cell function, tissue growth, and recovery from injury. And that's true in all different parts of the body. But hormones also affect bones, digestion and body weight, immune function, mood, mental alertness, memory, and sleep, all of which are things that are, those things toward the end are associated with the brain. And we'll see why that becomes really important when we're talking about risk for Alzheimer's disease. So estrogen in particular is the master regulator of the female brain. It's important for keeping neurons healthy and active. It has a number of important effects on the brain and nervous system, including protecting neurons, boosting the immune system, allowing new neuron connections to be built, and it promotes the release of chemicals that regulate mood and pain sensations. And these are some things that we see that are different between men and women, especially as women begin to get older. Estrogen also increases blood flow to the brain. So it's important to understand that changes in the production of sex hormones differs for men and women over their lives. So for example, for men, testosterone peaks in their 20s and then gradually declines over many decades. By contrast, for women, estrogen peaks in the late 30s and drops off dramatically in the 40s and 50s. So we start to see differences in risk factors for men and women because of these different changes that are happening in hormones. So this sudden dramatic shift in estrogen should make us curious about menopause. So what's happening in the brain during menopause? What happens when estrogen declines? Well, it turns out that women have faster deterioration of cognitive function after menopause that may be related to changes in estrogen levels. And I was surprised to find this out recently. The average woman spends between a third and a half of her adult life post-menopause. And part of this is why we're surprised by this is because things have changed in terms of people having longer lifespans and living longer. So women are actually spending quite a lot of their life now post-menopause. So that's an important period of life to be thinking about. So recent studies of brain imaging have shown noticeable differences between pre- and post-menopausal women's brains. There's a 30% reduction in women's brain metabolism, which means it becomes less efficient at using energy. And a brand new article just came out today that talks about different ways that older women's brains use energy as compared to premenopausal women's brains, which is worth understanding better. So you can see in the image on the left, there are more red and orange areas in the premenopausal woman's brain compared to the postmenopausal brain, which indicates greater brain metabolism. There is an increase in the accumulation of amyloid plaques, which we know are associated with the development of Alzheimer's disease. And a key brain region for memory function, the hippocampus, it changes during this period for women. So there's this shrinking of hippocampus in women's brains post-menopause compared to premenopause. So often when we think of menopause, we think of hot flashes, and those are the kinds of things that we typically associated with it, having night sweats and hot flashes. But interestingly, those symptoms occur because of the brain. The brain is not regulating body temperature correctly, which is what results in these hot flashes and night sweats. And that can continue post-menopause, usually around 3 to 5 years in many women. And that's important for heart disease risk. These are vascular related symptoms that are happening, and it's a dysregulation between the brain and the vascular system. But you may be less aware or maybe have heard less about brain fog and memory lapses that are common symptoms of menopause. Women complain of exhaustion, forgetfulness, and poor concentration. And around 60% of women have these kind of symptoms leading up to menopause, many of whom don't realize that these symptoms are related to these changing estrogen levels. Some women recuperate from these brain changes and others do not improve over time. What are some other symptoms of menopause that involve the brain? Women going through menopause report more memory problems and, I read that one already. Some other symptoms associated with changes in estrogen include poor sleep, fluctuating moods, and difficulty regulating stress. So a lot of women in this period complain of dysregulated sleep and wake cycles and insomnia, which is problematic for memory and cognitive function. So not being able to sleep well really can contribute to poor cognitive performance the next day, as I'm sure you've all experienced after having a poor night of sleep. However, when this becomes chronic, it can be very problematic. Women going through dramatic shifts in estrogen can also have depressive moods or mood swings. And stress. So during stress, the body's hormone building blocks make stress hormones instead of other needed hormones related to our body's metabolism. And so reduction in these building blocks can cause irritability, insomnia, hot flashes, and exhaustion. So there's lots of different brain and nervous system symptoms that result from changes in estrogen. So here's another topic that's really coming to light recently. 2/3 of all patients with Alzheimer's disease are women, and yet we don't consider Alzheimer's disease to be a women's health issue. It's a fact that women's risk of developing Alzheimer's is twice that of developing breast cancer, yet we always think of breast cancer as a women's health issue, but we don't think of Alzheimer's disease as a women's health issue. For a long time, it's been thought that the reason why more women than men develop Alzheimer's disease is just because they live longer, but there's compounding evidence that there are other risk factors that put women at greater risk besides just the fact that they live longer. For example, they have higher rates of depression throughout their lifetime, which is a risk factor for Alzheimer's. In past generations, they've had less education on average, and they exercise less on average, which are also risk factors. There's some new evidence coming to light about cardio and metabolic risk factors, especially related to changes in estrogen in midlife, that are also starting to be thought to be part of the reason why women have this increased risk. So what does estrogen actually do in the brain? Estrogen helps maintain mental function and prevent Alzheimer's disease. It helps the brain because it stimulates growth of neurons. It decreases neuron death that occurs with Alzheimer's disease, and it reduces production of substances that are associated with Alzheimer's, like beta amyloid and tau protein. It also enhances neurons' ability to recover from injury when there is injury. Estrogen is also important for vascular health. If you haven't heard yet, heart health is brain health. So vascular health is very important to our brain. The brain is a very highly vascularized organ. So what happens to our vascular system and our heart is very important for our brain as well. Estrogen supports vascular health because it reduces substances that cause the arteries to narrow. It reduces inflammation related to narrow blood vessels, and it increases blood flow to the brain. So estrogen is obviously very important for both our heart health and our brain health. There was a famous study in 2002 published by the Women's Health Initiative that changed clinical practice and increased fear about hormone replacement therapy. Many women suddenly stopped taking hormone therapy, and doctors were reluctant to prescribe it because of the findings that came from this study in 2002. However, decades later, more people are starting to recognize that there are many problems with that famous study that have come to light, including the fact that the age of the women in the study were older 10 years post-menopause, which means that they were not as likely to be benefited from the hormone replacement therapy that they were using. And there were different kinds of hormone therapy given in that study than are typically given. However, this big landmark study really changed the course of clinical practice for decades to come. And we're still, we're finding new results now, but having difficulty getting that into clinical practice because of this really dramatic finding that was so big in the news back in 2002. What it did actually find was that estrogen did not increase the risk of dementia and cognitive impairment in women on estrogen only. In fact, women who started hormones close to the time of menopause had a 50% reduced likelihood of developing dementia, and estrogen did not increase stroke risk in younger women who were in good vascular health. Now, if women take hormone replacement therapy after age 60, or if they have existing vascular risk factors, this may be problematic for them, but that is not necessarily the case for all women who are going through menopause, especially when they first begin the process. So it's really important to think of this midlife period during perimenopause and menopause as a window of opportunity. The benefits of estrogen replacement depend on the timing. So we need to have women take this within a decade after menopause onset, but not after age 60, when it can be ineffective and possibly risky. A review of a bunch of different studies called a meta-analysis, 71% of those studies showed that estrogen had beneficial effects on cognitive function. And so this is something that we should continue to investigate, despite the scare that happened back in 2002 that prevented a lot of people from being more interested in following up on this possibility. So a great resource on understanding menopause in women is the North American Menopause Society. And their guidelines help us decide whether or not we should use hormone replacement therapy in women. So age is the most important thing. So it's not recommended for women over age 65. It's not recommended in women with a history of breast or uterine cancer. And of course, it has to do with women's preferences as well. Not everybody is interested in taking this hormone replacement therapy. However, it has benefits, including reduced menopausal symptoms like hot flashes, dryness, night sweats, and osteoporosis, which is common during this period as well. It can improve sleep, mood, and sexual experiences for women going through menopause. And of course, we have to consider the risks like family history of breast cancer. And of course, there's always side effects, which include things like breast tenderness, mood changes, and uterine bleeding. If you want more information about menopause and its role in the brain and in Alzheimer's disease, there's a great organization called Women's Alzheimer's Movement.org, which is getting a lot of attention lately and funds a lot of really great research in this area. There's a book called Estrogen Matters, which really is focused on debunking the myths that came about from that 2002 Women's Health Initiative study and helps provide new insight on things that may have been misleading about those studies. And there's another book called The XX Brain, which is all about how women's brains are different than men's brains and includes discussion about women's risk for Alzheimer's disease. So I'm happy to pause here and take questions if people have them. Feel free to type in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Let's see, I can't see everybody's screens at once, so it's probably easiest if we type into the chat box. Let's see, here we have a chat. Did the 2002 study show an increased opportunity for cancer? Yeah, so that was one of the risks, was that they were concerned about increasing risk for breast cancer. And that actually is true, but not for every woman. So it's not necessarily the case that it increases risk for cancer among all women, but that is a consideration that people have to think about if they do have a history or other risks for breast cancer. Let's see. If you hit menopause at 60 and now 73, anything I can consider? That's a great question. So estrogen replacement therapy is not appropriate for women who are 10 years or more post-menopause. However, it really helps us to think about prevention. It's something we think about during the period in which women are beginning to go through menopause. I don't know that we have any answers right now for women who are already post-menopause with regard to hormone replacement therapy. However, if you are having any of the symptoms that I mentioned, it would be important to talk about that with your healthcare provider and to find out ways to treat that. For example, sleep problems are very important, and that is something that is worth treating and making sure that you are healthy in that area. Let's see, is KU during current studies on estrogen? I'm wondering if your question means specifically about estrogen and Alzheimer's disease. I don't think we are doing any studies about estrogen and Alzheimer's disease. However, I am currently seeking funding for studies of midlife and women's histories of hormone replacement therapy and menopause, because I think this is an important risk factor. There are a number of different sex-related differences in Alzheimer's disease risk, and menopausal history is one of them. So I am currently working on building a research project and a midlife cohort where we can study these important things that happen in midlife, including whether or not people used estrogen. Also, I have a doctoral student who is writing a dissertation looking at neuroimaging, so some PET imaging and some MRI imaging to see whether or not men's and women's brains differ, and whether or not those differences between men and women is related to menopausal history or use of hormone replacement therapy. So those are some studies that are ongoing right now. No one is currently using estrogen as a treatment related to memory or Alzheimer's disease at KU. Let's see, what about younger women who have hysterectomies? Yes, that is a great question. Women who have early onset of menopause due to hysterectomy are at increased risk of cognitive decline and dementia, particularly if they are not treated with hormone replacement therapy. There's lots of evidence showing that early induced menopause is a risk factor. So that is an important topic that women should be able to talk with their doctors about if they need to have an early hysterectomy. That has definitely been shown to be a risk factor. Let's see, what do you recommend for women taking anastrozole for 5 years and know she carries an ApoE? That's a good question too. ApoE is definitely a risk factor, particularly for women. We know that there is a relationship between ApoE4 and particular vascular risk factors and particular lipid risk factors, so cholesterol. So that is an important interaction, especially for a person who knows they have the ApoE4 gene. That is something we need to be careful with. I don't have any current clinical recommendations for an individual in that situation. That's something that we would need to talk to your specific doctor about. I don't think research broadly for the population has good clinical recommendations for individuals because we have to know about that individual's history. Let's see, are there increased negative outcomes for women over 60 on estrogen inhibitors? That's a great question that I do not know the answer to. I would imagine that a lot of the influence with the changes on estrogen are during that menopause, the perimenopausal period, because that's when the dramatic estrogen fluctuations are happening. I'm not as confident about what happens when a woman is in the postmenopausal stage, whether that has the same effect or not. I have not read any research to that effect. What are the thoughts on the benefit of bioidentical estrogen and Alzheimer's disease? That's a great question. So there's a lot of new research about bioidentical hormones, which part of the reason why the old studies are coming into question is because of the types of estrogens that were used then. We have a lot of new types of estrogen therapies that are available now, like these bioidenticals, which are supposed to be safer and more obviously similar, bioidentical to our own forms of estrogen instead of coming from other animals. I don't think I've seen any specific work about risk for Alzheimer's related to these new types of estrogens. It's probably out there, but I am not familiar with new research about the difference between bioidentical estrogens and Alzheimer's disease. That's something I'll have to look into. Oh, good question. Someone asked, what is the ApoE4 gene? So the strongest known genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is the ApoE4 gene. It is a particular form of a gene that some people have. It stands for apolipoprotein. So it has to do with a particular gene that regulates the brain's metabolism of fats. Fats are very important for the brain, particularly white matter. And we need fats in the brain, but we need particular kinds. So people with this E4 gene this particular kind of the E4 gene seemed to be at greater risk for Alzheimer's disease, as much as 4 times greater risk. So that's an important thing for anyone, but it is particularly important for women going through menopause, because there's a sort of interaction between having that gene and also having estrogen depletion. So that those two things kind of interact together in a compounding way. These are great questions. How does one find out if she has that gene? That's a great question. It's not currently recommended clinically for people to test this. However, one can find this out. For example, I have had my genome tested on 23andMe, and I happened to find out that I do not have an E4 allele, which is a relief, but a lot of people do not recommend everyone getting this test, because having this gene does not mean that you will get Alzheimer's disease, and not having the gene does not mean that you will not get Alzheimer's disease. So it's complex, and it interacts with other things. So it's important for people to understand it in context, because a lot of people don't necessarily understand that having the gene doesn't guarantee that you will get the disease, and not having the gene doesn't mean that you will not get the disease. It's a matter of increased probability of risk. But that is something that someone could be tested for, either by asking their doctor to test for it, or by purchasing one of the commercial products that you can buy to have your genes tested. Great questions. You all are always so informed and so have the greatest questions. Makes me think of new things that I need to go out and find out more about. Other thoughts? Well, thanks everybody so much for your time today. I am continuing to do some projects in this vein. As I mentioned, I am working to build a cohort of middle-aged people, both men and women, to look at some of the risk factors that occur in middle age that help prevent or put us at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease later. And one of the things that I'm very interested in is menopausal history and hormone replacement therapy. We have some other researchers who are interested also in looking at vascular risk factors that come about in midlife that put us at risk for developing Alzheimer's, and also family history of Alzheimer's disease. So this is a project that's ongoing. We're also working really hard to try to get a really representative sample. Most of the time in our studies, we have a lot of highly educated people who are already very active and very engaged, and we're trying to reach out to more groups of people that are maybe not as usually as included. So that's a big goal of our project. The question is, what are your age parameters for midlife? Right now, we're talking about age 40 to 60. Normally, when we talk about older adulthood, quote unquote, we talk about 65 plus, but we know that some of the earliest changes in the brain that indicate risk for Alzheimer's start happening 10 to 15 years before age 65. So 40 to 60 is a really important period of the life to start looking at. Question is, does it make a difference if estrogen is decreased due to a hysterectomy versus natural menopause? Yes. Hysterectomy does tend to cause a more dramatic shift, which if not treated with hormone replacement therapy can have much more impactful influence on the vascular system and the nervous system. So it is important when someone does have to have a hysterectomy to consider whether or not they should use hormone replacement therapy. Some people are not able to take hormone replacement therapy because of other health problems that they may have that are contraindicated. But yes, having a hysterectomy does have higher risk than going through natural menopause. How do we get more information on how to be a part of the midlife study? Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. We haven't started collecting data yet, but we will be soon. You are welcome to write me an email. I'm just at amberwatts@ku.edu, or there is also, you can see the The slide that's up here says participate in a study, spread the word, make a gift. So you can also email the KUADRC@kumc.edu. You can tell them that you saw my talk today, and they can also make sure that I get the information. So I also have a women's group on Facebook, on Instagram, and I have a newsletter as well. So if you're interested in following me on any of those platforms, please feel free to send me an email, and I will make sure that you get the information to connect to the Facebook page, Instagram feed, or the email newsletter. I spread information in all these different forums about the different research that myself and my team have been doing, particularly on midlife in women and the relationship between menopause and Alzheimer's disease. So if you are interested in following us, I would be very happy to welcome you to one of those groups. Thanks everybody for coming today. I will stick around in case people have more questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Amber Watts, and thank you everybody else for joining us today. You are free to email KUADRC@kumc.edu or myalliance@kumc.edu if you have additional questions. And we will have these recordings posted on our YouTube channel in about 24 hours. So you can find that by using the link in the